Chris is a member of the System Change, Not Climate Change network, which is a Canada and US network of, I could say, radical anti-capitalist climate activists. Here in Vancouver, the Vancouver Eco-Socialist Group is an affiliate, but we're not an exclusive affiliate here in Vancouver. And so if there are groups at the universities here or in other areas that want to be a chapter and don't particularly want to be a member of our chapter, that's fine. There's no sort of citywide exclusivity to system change, not climate change. So we invite you to visit the website, to look at the documentation of system change. The big issue that system change is talking about now is how can we advance an educational campaign for the transition that we need from capitalism to socialism, and we could talk a bit about that in the discussion as well. I'll pass around a mail list later so you can get notices of events like this that the Vancouver Eco-Socialists are organizing. We're really happy to be here. We're really happy that the Institute of the Humanities has organized this conference this weekend. There's just so much important stuff going on. We've got in the room here today guests who are here from other parts of the world, like Patrick, who's here from Kenya, and others. So it's a great event. We're really happy to be part of it. We're really happy that Chris took quite a bit of time and I could say some resources on his part to make sure that he could be here with you. So welcome to Chris, welcome to all you, and let's have a good discussion till 10:30. So.
All right. Thanks very much for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be here on unceded territory. And I actually thought I would start. I was inspired and humbled by a lot of what went on yesterday. And so I thought I might actually start by asking all of you for a couple of questions. One, why you decided to come to this session or what you hope to get out of it. And second, inspired by some things that happened yesterday, what you think would be useful for me within the realm of my area of knowledge for you to learn about that would help propel the struggle further forward. So I don't want to make any assumptions about what people know or don't know. So does anybody want to volunteer why they turned up or what they hope to get out of it or how they think I might help in the process that's going on here with resistance? Bearing in mind that I was asked to talk about broader than just the issue of Canadian extractivism, but put that into the context of global capitalism and talk about the dynamics of capital, what propels it, and what we might do to overturn it, because I think that's ultimately the only long-term viable solution for our species and many other species on the planet, the entire biosphere. So, anybody like to volunteer their thoughts on those questions?
Okay.
Go ahead.
For me, I'm sort of, in a way, done talking about capitalism, per se, and really want to talk about system change. Purely, what are we going to replace it with? How are we going to move there?
Okay.
And that's all I'm really after now, is saying we have to do something. I've been, 30 years in groups talking about it, and it doesn't seem to go anywhere, but more discussion and more discussion. And when do we get up off our seats and actually do something, I feel that frustration of when.
Okay.
And maybe I was saying to my brother this morning that for me a silver lining is climate change, because maybe that is going to smack us so hard that we're going to have to get off our seats and do something, and maybe that's what's going to motivate us in the end. I don't know.
Yeah.
My reason for coming is that I went to a talk the other day by a high-profile SFU evolutionary biologist who was arguing that we need to choose which species to save from extinction and which ones not to. And the whole premise of his argument is that we don't have enough resources, quote. So without even acknowledging that resources come from converting living organisms into commodities, his basis was saying, well, we can use all these fancy techniques for selecting which species deserve to be saved from extinction. And I find that profoundly disturbing, especially because it's coming from someone who gets paid a lot of money, is high profile, runs a lab at SFU. So, yeah.
Okay.
Well, okay, maybe not, but yeah, everybody listens to him. He was on CBC the other day. He did an interview on the radio.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
A quick one. You were at the COP conference, and by the way, COP, I don't know what the acronym stands for.
Conference of Polluters.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. So, you were at the big international conference in Warsaw last
Yeah.
year. You wrote some very good articles about these big international gatherings that are supposed to deal with the climate change crisis. So, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about, do these big gatherings, and we have one coming up in Paris later this year. Do they contribute, or are they actually an obstacle to what has to be done?
Yeah.
I would like you to address the argument that there are too many people on the planet, which there clearly are not, and which I think is a capitalist cop-out for what's going on, because there are people like Chris Hedges, who spoke last night, apparently are propagating this idea, and I think it needs to be debunked.
Yeah, that was a thoroughly depressing and horrifying in many ways talk. Actually, I found it disturbing in many regards. Not just for that reason, but yeah. Anybody else? Otherwise, I'm going to start talking. Yes, go ahead.
Quickly, just thinking about like this, capitalism is very good at absorbing resistance, and so trying to think about sort of key places of weakness where possibly that wouldn't happen, ways to infiltrate, intervene.
Okay. That's something that Caleb talked about yesterday. Kind of the idea of choke points. All right, so the image there, does anybody have any ideas of what happened or when it occurred? It's an interactive.
Just a comment. You've picked a very slippery image, because you can look at that and you almost go, oh yeah, it looks like natural erosion. But I'm led to ponder this is not natural erosion. But it's very, it's very much on the edge. It could go either way.
Yeah, it's not a natural erosion.
1,000 years ago, an Aboriginal community mined that to get red clay to build housing.
Any other ideas? So it could be a lot of different things, but it is mining. Not for red clay, though, for gold. One guess was 1,000 years ago. Any ideas about when this occurred, when the mining was happening? A few days ago? Decades? It's in northwestern Spain. A few decades. Any other ideas?
Roman times.
Yeah, 2,000 years ago, actually. So this is extractivism from 2,000 years ago, built on enormous quantities of human slave labor from all over Europe that is still highly visible. How did they do this with a level of technology, even replacing machines by humans or having humans as their machines? They constructed enormous hydraulic works, or at least the slaves did, not the Romans, in order to slowly pressurize the water from the rivers below and force it to high pressure hose, sluice away all of this alluvial soil, where then they collected the sieve for the gold down in the rivers below. And so an enormous project where all of that wealth then flowed back to Rome, the center of the empire, and still clearly visible today. So in many regards, as much as we are obviously talking about the ways in which extractivism has expanded towards a global scale, it's also not as much of a new phenomenon as one might think. And there was just a recent paper out that just a couple of weeks ago actually, that illustrated that you could actually pinpoint when the Spanish started extracting gold and silver from the mines in Potosí, in Bolivia and elsewhere in Peru, by new extraction technologies that they had pioneered. And we can now read this in the geological record, or at least in ice cores, from Peruvian glaciers, which are fast melting. So it's a good job this research was already done. And Of course, now, as the paper makes clear, several orders of magnitude less than what was perceived prior to in the 20th century, but nevertheless significant enough to be read 500 years later. I think that this is another example. There's been some debate. People may have seen the paper about when should we start. If we're going to start a new era, or a new epoch, I should say, should we start? Where should we start it? Right? If we're ending the Holocene and we're going into the Anthropocene, right? The Holocene means most recent. So actually, if we have a new epoch, it's more than most recent, which doesn't really make sense. But if we call it the Anthropocene, the age of man, when would we start it? So there's a lot of debate about when that would be. Some scientists say, well, the most obvious answer to that question would be the nuclear tests, right? Because you can't base it, if you're going to declare a new era, you can't base it on cities or infrastructure or anything, because we're talking about geological time. And so what would that be? Well, the longest lasting impact of humanity might be the irradiation of the atmosphere, which would be going on for at least 100,000, measurable for at least 100,000 years. And that stems from a very specific so-called golden spike in 1945 and through the 40s. But a recent paper argued that actually 1610 would be a far more appropriate measurement for when we should date the start of the Anthropocene. And the reason for that is because there's a significant drop in CO2 emissions across the Americas around that time, primarily because of the eradication of at least 50 million indigenous people and the end of farming, on large-scale farming. Tree cutting and farming and so on, which does generate excess CO2. You can actually see the drop in CO2 levels from the ending of, by conservative estimates, the lives of 50 million indigenous people, by other estimates, 90 million. It's a very contemporary debate, but also a very historical debate too. And having just been in Bolivia, a lot of us on the left, in the West, and so on, are rightly inspired by a lot of the events that have gone on in Bolivia. And yet when you actually look at what Bolivia is investing in, constrained by the limits, I just recently wrote an article on Bolivia and what's going on there, constrained by the limits of international capital, but nevertheless, when you look at the scale of investment, number 1, 2, and 3, mining, hydrocarbons, electrical energy, and then if you look at the eradication of extreme poverty, way down the list, health, even further down the list. And so in terms of the scale of extraction, actually, one of the quotes in the article is from a mining activist there, who says during the Morales era, more gold and silver has been extracted than in the whole of the colonial period. And so this is a map actually. The pre-Morales mines are in orange, and the post-Morales mines are in red. So you can see a large expansion of mining in Bolivia as the economic growth has taken off in that country. So this raises all kinds of questions about, well, we talked a little bit yesterday, what does an exit strategy from capitalism really look like? Because if Bolivia is, I think, rightly seen as perhaps the most hopeful country that we can look towards, where the social movements have really put, for the first time in South American history, post-colonial history, an indigenous person in power to represent them. And he rose to power specifically resting on the basis of the social movements. Then it gets to kind of your question about, well, how do we really escape the dynamics of capitalism? What is it that's propelling this system? Where this is a river in the Altiplano, like 2 billion other people in the developing world, there is an almost complete lack of sanitation in Bolivia. And so when we also think about, well, what would a different world really look like? How do we establish sanitation for 2 billion people so that rivers don't look like this, where they now have to keep all of their animals away from it? This is water coming down from El Alto, straight into Lake Titicaca, where the sanitation, there is a sewage system, but it's completely overwhelmed by the illegal slaughterhouses or illicit slaughterhouses and various other things that go on in El Alto. At the same time, as we know, according to the last report, the impact of emissions, severe, pervasive, and irreversible. Failure to reduce emissions, the group of scientists and other experts found, could threaten society with food shortages, refugee crises, flooding in major cities, entire island nations, mass extinction, lots of other pretty horrendous stuff that people probably know about, but it's not that we don't know about it, right? And I think that this is obviously an important point, an important thing to bear in mind, although we've known about it for a long time. So this is a quote from Rachel Carson, 1953, talking about the ways in which our climate was already changing. Her emphasis and focus at the time was on the oceans, but it's an indication of the way in which everything is connected to everything else, to quote Barry Commoner. And so there was a report out just a couple of days ago in National Geographic. The deep oceans are losing some of their oxygen. Why is that a problem? Because obviously fish need oxygen, so does everything else living down there. What it means is it's actually driving the fish higher up into more shallow waters, which actually means they're more likely to be able to get caught in fishing nets and so on. So there are actually other aspects of climate change. Why is there less oxygen? Partly because the oceans are warming and gas cannot dissolve to the same extent in warmer water than it can in colder. So the oceans are holding less water. This is less talked about than ocean acidification. But it means that fish and other organisms that live in the oceans are moving not just north and south, but also upwards. And so that actually facilitates then fishing for them. Which is obviously a problem because we're already overfishing. Now, just to get to capitalism for a second, if we're overfishing, then we're running out of fish. What is the response? The response to capitalism in this reductionist paradigm that it has with regard to science is to apply science to this problem. My background is in science. It's not to go back and say, well, if we're overfishing, how could we put in quotas? How could we establish limits? How could we regenerate the fishing resources? Not at all. It's to invent another technology to get around the first problem that you already created, which is fish farms, right? Which actually means you have to fish more, because what do those fish eat? Other fish. So you're fishing for fish to feed the fish that you're keeping now in the fish farms. If that's not enough, which it seems like it's not. Okay, so we haven't got enough fish farms now with all of the negative consequences that entails, people probably know about. What are you going to do now? Are you going to revisit your original problem and maybe come up with some kind of combined, collective, cooperative solution to that? No, you're not if you're a capitalist. What are you going to generate next? Well, if your fish aren't growing fast enough in your fish farms, the next step, obviously, is to genetically modify those fish so that they grow faster and larger. And so that is already obviously being done with the about to be released by the EPA, anyway, the US EPA, the regulations on genetically modified salmon, with all of the negative implications that has in terms of mixing with wild populations and so on. So a fairly bleak view, although interestingly enough, a lot of scientists, people I'm sure have heard of James Hansen, a lot of scientists are waking up to some of the radical implications of their science. And part of the problem with the Anthropocene, or wanting to label that, was actually that on the one hand it's a good idea, right, to emphasize that now we are controlling things to such an extent that things are changing because of what we're doing. On the other hand, it's really appealing to the wrong audience. It's still this paradigm of scientists saying, well, if we just explain the science, right, scientific rationality will trump any economic drive by the system itself. Now, clearly that's not happening. And so some scientists are starting to break with that. So Kevin Trenberth, people at the Hadley Climate Center, Alice Bowes, Michael Mann, who was threatened with a lawsuit by his own university, basically, for talking about climate change are now speaking out in more radical terms. So this is obviously a good thing. On the other hand, there's a lot of glorification in the United States, which is where I live right now, on how exciting the shale revolution really is, and how if you try and evade it, you'll be left as a subject of history rather than one of the motivating forces, one of the prime movers. Walter Russell Mead is, Council of Foreign Affairs. This magazine is read by the ruling class of the US to get an idea of what they should be up to. And so not an extreme view of any kind. Whereas Michael Ignatieff, writing in 2003, being an imperial power, however, is more than being the most powerful nation or just the most hated one. It means enforcing such order as there is in the world and doing so in the American interest. It means laying down the rules America wants on everything from markets to weapons of mass destruction, while exempting itself from other rules, the Kyoto Protocol on climate change, for example. So it's pretty blatant. He even calls it the burden, although in the article he denies that America is anything to do with carrying any white man's burden. But a major opinion former in the US talking about the ways in which the US could be a new kind of imperial empire. I'll skip over this, but more bad news in terms of a lot of people are focused on climate change, quite rightly, but we have to remember that if we're going to think about things more holistically, which is really the only way in which we're going to escape this problem, then there are many other parameters to the crisis, climate change being only the overarching one. And somebody else who came up with the latest study for the American Academy of Sciences. It's clear the economic system is driving us towards an unsustainable future, and people of my daughter's generation will find it increasingly hard to survive. History has shown that civilizations have risen, stuck to their core values, and then collapsed because they didn't change. That's where we are today. And this is where I think the whole paradigm, Jared Diamond's paradigm about collapse, Easter Island, everything that was talked about a lot yesterday is completely misplaced, because what was wrong with those that society in particular was not the fact that they were overpopulated or they didn't realize that there was only one tree left. It was actually that the social system that they lived under and the technology limitations that they also existed under, those two things combined to make it impossible for them to find solutions. Although actually, if you read about it, they came up with ingenious solutions, the society, to carry on living in different ways, conserve water, conserve rations, and actually fish at different levels in different ways. But it was the fact that more and more resources were put towards irrational things, such as statue building. So the largest statues on Easter Island are actually built towards the end, multi-ton statues. So imagine the amount of human resources going to that kind of activity in order to appease the gods, to keep the people in power, and so on. That could have been used and devoted to other things if there'd been some kind of social revolution. And so obviously there were limits to that question in those times from a technological perspective, but we don't have those limits in terms of technology, right? It would be depressing if we didn't know the technological answers, but we know all of those. We know what's possible. It's really just a completely a question of social and political change. Of course, if you don't change the social system, anybody know what's going on here?
Watering pesticides?
They're not watering the lawn. It's not pesticides exactly. It's California.
Spraying green grass.
They're painting it green, yeah. So there are restrictions on water use in California, and so they can't water their lawns. But in order to keep them looking green, they are spray painting them green. So this is a new expanding business. And I think that this illustrates in microcosm the fact that capitalism can turn anything into a commodity, right? The idea of shock doctrine, but you don't really need a shock because they will commodify anything. They've managed to commodify, for example, pollution, right? They've turned what has no value to society, carbon dioxide into something that could be traded on a multi-billion-dollar scale, rather than do something actually about it. And this is where also the problem with some people make comparisons with how other treaties have worked, like for the ozone layer problem, which actually is kind of on its way to being solved, right? There was a treaty, it did come about. What's the difference between what they did with the ozone layer and CFCs and emissions trading? Well, one of the big difference is in all of the international treaties that are talked about, there is no mention of fossil fuels at all in any of the 20 years, in any of those documents. And there is no mention of anything about changing production, which is exactly what happened with the CFCs and the ozone. What they did was say ozone production has to be phased out over a set number of years. So if we actually wanted to tackle CO2 production, emissions and so on, what we would be doing is talking about the elimination of the production of it, as opposed to just talking about emissions once it's already in the atmosphere. And so that would be part of the obvious answer in terms of solutions. Of course, whatever we have been doing has been worse than useless, because this is from the 5th assessment report, and you could see between 2000 and 2010, the different colors are different gases. But if you can look between 2000 and 2010, the last decade, it's accelerated over the previous 3 decades. So actually we've emitted more gas in the decade that we're supposed to be doing something about it than the previous 3 decades. In other words, things are not only just getting worse, they're getting worse at a faster rate. We also know that about 80% is from fossil fuel production. And we know that about 80% of emissions come from just 10 countries. So if we actually want to do something, it's those 10 countries that we should be focused on. Let me just skip over this because I think people probably know it. Probably, right? And I think there's a good quote from Karl Marx on this, as there often is. On the one hand, there have started into life industrial and scientific forces which no epoch of the former human history had ever suspected. On the other hand, there exist symptoms of decay far surpassing the horrors recorded of the latter times of the Roman Empire, to go back to the original photograph. And I think we see all of that today. We see enormous ability to do things at the same time as we're supposedly constrained, that we now have to pick and choose which species are going to survive. And I think we can make pretty good guesses about which those species would be, the ones that we like or are useful to us, as opposed to any kind of more holistic understanding of what that really means. And just to get back to the question of sanitation, this is also about electricity. How are we going to create a world where everybody can have a decent existence, which means electricity, right? Where a third of the population of the planet has no access to it. Or any kind of modern fuel, actually, primarily located in China and India, but other places as well. This is specifically about the Asia-Pacific region. And so I was recently in Vietnam, and 10% growth rate a year means that in a couple of decades or so, the size of the economy will be doubled. And so for many developing countries, this is seen as the way out, just like Bolivia. And yet, what does it actually mean? Both in terms, not primarily in terms of CO2 production, because they have the right to develop, but what does it mean for the people within those countries with this development paradigm? And it's not like the people in charge don't know what's going on either. So they've actually mapped out for the next 40 years how bad it's going to be, the OECD. And so these are the world damages to 2035 by inaction on climate change, world damages to 2060, primarily in agriculture, declining. But what are they really concerned about? The only thing that they're concerned about, why is this a problem for the OECD, the World Bank, etc.? The reason it's a problem is because it curtails growth. That's the only reason that this is a problem, not for anything else. And in fact, they summarize their findings in this paper that came out last year. You can't read the top part. International agreement and cooperation is essential. They say that. This is becoming more difficult. Why? Because emerging economies grow and challenge more established economies, leading to a multipolar world. Increased competition, divergent economic and political interests. What are their solutions? Growth is essential. Any restrictions to growth need to be dealt with. More trade liberalization, etc., deregulation. Where attempts to decreasing inequality clash with growth imperatives, growth should be prioritized. If you live longer, that's a problem for capitalism, increasing health costs. Something needs to be done. They don't specify what, but they are pretty clear something has to be done. And they're also concerned about the fact that if more people are getting educated, this is going to cause not just potentially social problems, but also going to cost money. This also has to be addressed by shifting more of the burden of education onto the people getting educated, i.e. student debt. These are all their recommendations. Expectations for Paris, 0. According to an MIT study that was recently released. And to the extent that this is becoming a phenomenon, partly as a result of, people talk about action. Well, we obviously saw a lot of action in 2011 in the Middle East, North Africa, but also in North America and around the world, the rise of Occupy. Nobody would be talking in these terms without those movements. I think it's important, as depressed as we can get sometimes, to recognize that there has been a shift in global mass consciousness, and it's very evident in the United States, particularly in the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been the most inspiring demonstrations I've been on in I don't know how long, where you know, the chant that's been around since the anti-globalization movement, whose streets are streets. I always feel a bit ambivalent about that chant, because it's always been chanted when I'm surrounded by NYPD and cops, and it's like, it's not really, you know, you can't do anything, right? They arrest you all the time. But with the Black Lives Matter movement in New York City and elsewhere, that was totally not true. Actually, it was our streets, led by Black and Latino youth. All of the streets were taken over on multiple nights in New York City, and areas of the city completely closed down, where the police melted away into the background. They protected certain things. I saw them erecting barricades. This is so stupid. Erecting barricades around the Bull on Wall Street, because they thought we would trash that next. It's like, you don't even understand what we're demonstrating for right now. So there was loads of cops surrounded that behind barriers as we marched everywhere we wanted to, night after night. And so this is tremendously inspiring. And it also brings up the question of, when have social movements been most successful in the United States? Historically, and most importantly, obviously the Civil War. And if you read David Roediger's book, most recent book, Seizing Freedom, which is fantastic, illustrates just how connected not just ex-black slaves were, but freed black slaves with the white poor workers in the South, and generates the first movement, well, not the first movement, but one of the first movements for women's suffrage. And these people at the time saw all of those things as interconnected. There was also, for the first time, a disability rights movement. It wasn't called that, but so many people, black and white, had been maimed during the Civil War that people saw a whole new conception of what it meant, and thought that there should be social provision for all of those people who'd fought for freedom. And so that only ended forcibly with the imposition of the fall of radical Reconstruction and the imposition of the new Jim Crow. Of course, if people were already inherently racist and it hadn't stirred up anti-racist feeling, you wouldn't need all the laws to keep people apart in the first place. And so I don't often quote the Pope, But he has been saying a number of things about how evil capitalism is. Not just him, but also the Dalai Lama. I am farther to the left than the Chinese leaders. They are the capitalists. As people may have seen, ActionAid, Greenpeace, Oxfam just released a statement blaming the 1%, so basically taking the language of Occupy, and stating that actually we can't rely on technology, we can't rely on markets. Both of those things have been the answers so far, right? We have to actually stop tinkering at the edges and talk about structural change. Exciting stuff. I don't think that they're practically going to put their money into doing those things, but nevertheless it illustrates that a change. And probably not the first people to recognize that some kind of change needs to go on. But this is what we're told to do, right? Very, very explicit. If we're not buying enough things in North America, then somebody else has to do it. Or this is the kind of sick society that we live in. I took this photo. These are child's custom in training, it says. So child-sized vehicles for training in consumerism. And with all of this kind of middle-class blaming of people wanting to consume as if we're the problem, you have to realize that, as people may well do, that over $1 trillion gets spent on marketing and advertising in the US alone in order to convince us to buy. Now, if we were so driven to buy things and that satisfied our wants and needs, you wouldn't need advertising. So why do they spend $1 trillion on it? It illustrates that they're lying. Let me skip over this. Meanwhile, the US is awash, quite literally, in oil and gas production. This is why the US is not going to change. Apart from dominating the planet, they've got most of the newly found oil and shale. So out of the 8 trillion barrels, the idea of peak oil is like long gone, and peak anything else for that matter. But out of the 8 trillion barrels that they think is recoverable, 6 are in the US. So they are going to extract those and set fire to them, if at all possible. And you obviously know in Canada, Western Canada as well. But this is kind of the scale of the problem that we're faced with, right? If we are building a new society, what are we going to do with these hundreds of thousands of miles of pipeline, right? There are 400 Superfund sites in New York State alone. How would we reorganize society what are we going to do with nuclear waste, right? How would we reorganize society to deal with the massive problems, not just in terms of giving sanitation, electricity to the world, but also undoing all of the problems bequeathed to us by 250 years of capitalism. I mean, this is way more extensive than the river system, right? And this is just natural gas. Or they're so frantic to get the oil out. I don't know whether people have seen this satellite photo before or not, but the Bakken Shale over there, hardly anybody lives there, right? North Dakota. What are those, without being rude or anything, but relatively speaking, you can see the Bakken Shale activity is brighter than Minneapolis, St. Paul, a major city, even though people don't live there. What's that from? Flaring, right? So they're flaring all of the natural gas. So the shale oil comes with natural gas. They're usually found together. Why are they just setting fire to the shale? Because it's so profitable to get the oil out that they can't be bothered to build the pipelines for the gas. So they just set fire to it. So the stuff that they're trying to frack for in the east, right, which we just banned in New York State after a 6-year fight, longer than that really, but the stuff that they want to frack for in the east, natural gas, they're setting fire to in the west because it's cheaper and more profitable to do that than be bothered to get the pipelines working. And that's a quote from the regulator saying, well, we'd like to do something, but we don't want to slow things down. The government regulator. So that, and you can look at a similar photo for the Eagle Ford in Texas field too. And so some of the extractivism that has been located in faraway places, generally speaking, is now spreading all over the globe. But it illustrates the short-term, totally unplanned nature of capital, and also the ways in which, on a more positive note, if you think about, well, we've got not much acreage left over for farming, actually they allocate as much land for oil and gas production as they do for farming. And so if we could easily rearrange that equation. And then we're often told that overconsumption is a problem. Well, I think we have to look at who's doing the overconsuming and get rid of them, and then we'd have a much better handle on things. So the vast majority of consumption goes to the people who are already at the top. So the bottom 80% only do 40% of the consumption, and which has gone down over the last period of time, whereas at the top it's gone up. So when we think about, well, what are our limits? How do we rearrange things? Actually, there's a lot of space once we get rid of the top 1%. The top 1%, $6.2 trillion in wealth in 1 year. What could we do with $6.2 trillion in wealth? Or it doesn't even make any healthcare sense, actually. So National Academy of Sciences, 2010, what are the damages created by the coal industry? 62 billion. What would it take to pay off every single miner in the United States and give them a full pension of 50 grand a year, tax-free? A tenth of that. So we could shut down the entire coal industry, give a very good income to every single coal miner, and still have 90% of the money left over that we would save from healthcare and so on and so forth. So when people say that we are constrained by things, what we're constrained by is capital. Not anything to do with how much money we've got or resources or like the inability to save some species or other species. And I think that because we're forced into this mindset that everything is scarce all the time, and it is for us, right, in terms of we're all competing all the time for housing, education, a job, against each other, because there's never enough somehow or another. Actually, there's vast oceans of capital and wealth that are being squandered, human as well as natural, right? What could we do when you think of all the amazing things that we've done in the world, and the lander just landing on a comet 400,000 miles away from the Earth, a lander this size on it. When we've done all those things with a fraction of the human potential, what would happen if we had 7 billion minds free to think about solving problems? That would be an amazing world to live in. And we've got more than enough energy. A fraction of 1% from the sun would generate enough energy for the whole of humanity. So we get 101,000 terawatts from the sun. Currently we use 15. And so I'm not saying we would do this, right? But it illustrates that all of this nonsense about intermittency and how would we build the wind turbines and all these other things is propaganda. In terms of some things that we found even out under capitalism, some studies that have been done in Vienna to change the way and look at the way cities are used, for example, with respect to males and females, used completely differently. Something they've been done called gender mainstreaming. So how do women use the cities differently to men based on the sexism inherent to capitalism? And what have they done about it? But what they've found out is that women were much more restricted using the cities than men were, because they used them in totally different ways. They weren't going to work and then coming back. They were in their neighborhoods looking after kids, pushing strollers and going to parks, taking them there, going to the doctor, etc. Things that are very gendered under capitalism. So they also found out that parks, up to a certain age, about 10 or so, girls were using public parks as much as boys. But after that time, girls stopped using parks in Vienna. So they instituted all of these measures. More public transport. They've been building apartment buildings where at the bottom of the apartment building you have all the things that you need contained in a green space with a playground in the middle and a doctor's pharmacy on hand so that you can actually live surrounded by other people who are taking care of kids and not have to worry about things. They also changed the nature of parks to make them smaller so that and more divided up, so it wasn't all about kind of male-dominated boy things. And they found that actually that the ratio changed in a very short period of time, that it's now kind of 50-50 all the way through. So even under capitalism, things can be re-looked at in important ways. So, how long? I should be finishing, right? Sorry. In terms of action and what we're going to do, I think some of the things are, well, ultimately we need to be fighting on both fronts, right? On the one hand, we need to be fighting for things that people are already fighting for in terms of important reforms. So winning time for ourselves to prevent some of the bad things that are being talked about happening. So in many ways, that doesn't even matter what we're fighting against, as long as we're actually fighting. So when you were saying, well, we've got to get up and do things, first of all, lots of people have been doing that for lots and lots of years. We just don't necessarily hear about it all the time. And there are lots of people who have put their lives on the line for many, many years to do that. I think that number of people is increasing all the time. And this ideological change at the top, as a result of the last 4 years of struggle, is precipitating a crisis amongst not just the ruling elite, but also the middle class who are happy to try and juggle things with the NGOs and so on. It's becoming more problematic. So the idea that Canada is planning for unrest amongst First Nations is also an indication that unrest is growing, right? And so I think probably we all are tremendously inspired by that. Why do we want victories? For a couple of reasons. One is because they make our lives better, so that's a good reason. The other reason is because we actually have to build our organization. And people have talked a lot about connecting different things together, different struggles. We obviously need to generalize because what's at the root of this is the growth imperative of capital. Capital can't exist without growth, and as Naomi Klein has said, that is a logical inconsistency on a finite planet. And yet there is no end to that, right? They know everything as well as we do. They're the ones who produce the reports. And yet it doesn't affect at all the trajectory of capital. They are locked in both in terms of material terms and ideologically. So we need to win some battles to build up our sense of organization, because I think that's what we've been really lacking for the last 30 odd years, is not just a lack of organization, but a lack of any sense that we can demand more, right? And I think we have to go back to something that was talked about in the French Revolution and other revolutions too, but the idea of revolutionary time. That things kind of in an Einsteinian sense, as opposed to a Newtonian mechanical sense, time can speed up and does speed up during revolutionary periods. So that what formerly you'd think took 50 years or 100 years to take place actually takes place in a few years. And so the emancipation of slaves or any number of other significant revolutionary impacts occur over very, very short periods of time. So the question is, how do we get to a period when we're looking at that kind of thing, which is the kind of crunch question, if we're prepared to accept that this is not the best of all possible worlds, all right? Can we put on the table that we should be looking at a totally different society, one run along completely different lines, in terms of, instead of competition, private property, production for profit, we're looking at cooperation and production for need based on real democracy, right? What would that kind of world look like? How would we reorganize all of our cities to reintegrate ourselves with food, with each other, and begin to see ourselves not as a set of relationships between things, but as a set of relationships between each other species, and the planet that we ultimately all depend on. And I guess just to finish with a quote from Marx, who is, the arch materialist or whatever, in a very non-materialist kind of way. Private property has made us so stupid and one-sided that an object is only ours when we have it, when it exists for us as capital, or when it is directly possessed, eaten, drunk, worn, inhabited, etc. In short, when it's used by us. He talks about the ways in which actually all of our senses are degraded just by the concept of owning something. In other words, it's yours or it's mine, as opposed to it's ours. And that in itself degrades us from our own species, so that not only the five senses, but also the so-called mental senses, what he calls the practical senses of will, love, etc. He labels as a practical sense. In a word, human sense. The human nature of the senses comes to be by virtue of its object. The forming of the five senses is a labor of the entire history of the world down to the present. So I think that is an important way in which Marx talks about all that we know is actually come through all of the prior generations. And then the sense caught up in crude practical need has only a restricted sense. For the starving man, it is not the human form of food that exists, only its abstract existence as food. The care-burdened, poverty-stricken man has no sense for the finest play. The dealer in minerals sees only the commercial value, but not the beauty and the specific character of the mineral. He has no mineralogical sense. In other words, he really doesn't know anything about rocks because of the fact that he's trading them for a profit, and that distorts his whole humanity. And I think that is an important point. Thus, the objectification of the human essence, both in its theoretical and practical aspects, is required to make a man's sense human, as well as to create the human sense corresponding to the entire wealth of human and natural substance. In other words, it's not just about humans, but also about nature. And Marx talks about those in the same exact breath, as I think in a very contemporary sense. Capitalist science has been very good at solving problems directed towards capital. In other words, a very reductionist mindset. It's been very poor and avoided the kind of problems that it's not very good at, which is the more holistic understanding of the interconnections between things. And so it's that kind of process approach regarding the interactions as the important things that I think we would also want to see reborn in a different society to help us understand and rearrange and overcome all of the very significant problems that we have. Because even in these dark days, I think there's a lot of scope for revolutionary change. And I think we live in a whole new era. Revolt, rebellion, resistance are on the agenda in a way that they haven't been for many decades. And that is very exciting. So we could talk about it right now. Thanks.
So you don't need me to moderate anything, but I will say Chris's book is here for sale. It's $15. Also, speaking of Marx and ecology, John Bellamy Foster's book, Marx's Ecology, and a couple other titles that you can look at and buy. And I'll circulate a mail list, and it has the web address for the Vancouver Eco Socialist Group, and also I'll put on the web address for System Change, Not Climate Change, which you can, as I said earlier, just go ahead on your own with that, and we'll very much look forward to to working together on this in Vancouver. So I'll turn everything over to Chris.
So Chris, I had a question for you. Well, first a comment and then a question. I really liked your example of Vienna. I think it was very much to the point. You say that things are possible within capitalism. I think what you omitted though was that this is a socialist municipal government,
right.
And it's been in place really since the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's managed to put this into place, mm-hmm. and it's referred to, as you know, Red Vienna,
right.
And it includes questions of city planning, design, architecture, and it's been quite a remarkable success. And I think it's great that you point to that as a possibility. At the same time, it's a product of some very unique mm-hmm. circumstances and a unique kind of intellectual and political culture. So I thought it was great. Going back to Marx, the 1844 manuscripts and so on, 100% with you. I think that there's some really great stuff in there. In fact, I'm working on a book on the aesthetic dimension of Marx, and I think that's really key that you're bringing out the question of the senses. Right? The senses, especially in mediating our relation to nature, our metabolism of nature. But one of the things that I want you to respond to, because this is a kind of strategic forum, or a forum about strategic questions, and that is that from Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky, Lukács, onward, and of course the Frankfurt School, there was a real concern about how the stupidity that private property enforces, as you rightly point out through Marx, leads to real crises of rationality and the possibility of practical action. Right? They all had different responses to this, and I think that what you're doing in your talk is really suggesting that, showing the different ways in which capitalism is irrational, right? And we need to chart different paths beyond that, which entails a different kind of rationality, one that would entail planning and so on. And I think that's very much to the point. But one of the real challenges surely must be the way in which people internalize certain forms of subordination, logics of subordination, I would say, right? A kind of identification with the aggressor, which I would say is actually a matter of public policy, right? Called monetarism, and the so-called trickle-down effect. So essentially, the public is encouraged to think that if the 1% does well, everyone will in some way benefit. And I think what you're pointing to is that logic just it can't hold up. It's fraying now, but it's still very powerful, right? Despite the failure of austerity as a response to 2007, 2008, what do we get? We get more austerity, right? It's as if the pain is some kind of gain, right? And this is really, from my standpoint, and I'd like to hear what you have to say on this. From my standpoint, this is really the challenge. Not for folks in the room and people we've heard from already, but the public out there, I think, is very much still invested in this way. So I'd like.
Okay. Well, maybe other people have ideas about that too. You facilitating? Oh, I am. Oh, okay. And here's a chair for you. Oh, it's all right. Go ahead.
Well, I agree with whatever the brother just said, but the problem with rationality is, as Marx said, that if having a revolution was just a matter of being rational, we would have had it a long time ago. There's a whole bunch of other processes that go into this development. And while you point out, Chris, that it's encouraging the level to which resistance has been shown and is increasing everywhere on the planet over the last little while, there's also another dimension that isn't increasing in quite so encouraging a way, which is strategic thinking of going beyond resistance to replacing the power structure. The question of power, I guess, is the place where we need to do more work, both in discussion and in strategic planning. Because there's a lot of people who have the idea that you can reform capitalism. There's a lot of people that have the idea that you can lobby the people that are in government, who are in fact in the employ of the corporations more than they are in the employ of the electorate. So I think we need to talk more about what we want to replace them with. Democratic planning, cooperation. I mean, there's a debate back and forth about whether the word socialism is useful or a barrier, but if we break down socialism and what we mean about it practically and start talking to people about that, I think we need to spread that notion more quickly than it is being spread now.
Yeah, I can give an example of that. Although in the US at the moment, more people like the word socialism than they do capitalism. So I think that's changing.
What they mean by that in the United
States. Of course, yeah.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit, because your book's titled Ecology and Socialism, but in Naomi Klein's book, she does point out that there's a state of extractive socialism, which is what effectively Bolivia and Ecuador have moved towards. And so, wondering if along that lines of are there aspects of socialism that we can draw out? Are there, again, specific portions of socialism that still fit that growth logic that need to be addressed as toxic?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think maybe one way to address this is that we need to redefine our relationship to the natural world, and we need to be fully integrated with our land bases. So I think that's one thing that's maybe missing from this discussion, is that we need to be preserving ecosystems. We need to be connected to our local land bases. That's the way indigenous communities function for many years. And I'd like to suggest also that as a movement, maybe we can move away from using terms like environment. I know that term came up in your presentation. It's not concrete enough to mean anything to anybody anymore. Most of us live in cities, and the environment is concrete buildings. We should use words like plants and animals, living organisms, even words like nature. I think most people understand. So I think we have to start considering how to turn our society into one that respects life on Earth in general.
That's a small, rather silly question. I'm surprised you read Karl Marx. Yeah, because those are the sort of things today's generation doesn't want to even imagine exist. And perhaps we need to direct people to what sorts of old stuff or outdated kind of things people need to go back to, because the problem is pretty much the same. And so I don't know how it feels to live in the US, which should be the heart of capital. And sometimes just sharing what living in the US means might also be useful to lots of other people who don't have a mental image. What this capital thing is. It's just downgrading it to really basic, small things like, please guys, read Karl Marx. So things like that. Yeah, not a question, just.
Well, interestingly enough, in 2000, just to that point, in 2008, and socialism in general, in 2008, people may know, Obama was being accused of being a socialist by the right-wing media in the United States when he was running for office. And of course, he unfortunately is not a socialist or anything like it. But it became the #1 word Googled on during that period of time, just prior to the 2008 elections. And the reason for that was because lots of people were tremendously inspired by Obama at the time. And so they're like, well, if he's a socialist, maybe I am too, and let me go find out what that is. So I think the idea is certainly morphing in positive ways for a lot of different historical reasons. But I have a number of things to say about some really good questions that people raised. Oh, sorry.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
Before you go on to just, and I really enjoyed your talk. One thing that really struck me at some point there was, I wrote down, wasn't exactly what you're saying, but I wrote down, it seems almost like our incredible problem-solving ability as human beings is part of the problem. That is, we keep adding what we think is a solution on top. And then we add another solution, then we add another solution. And these are all kind of workarounds. We're like jerry-rigging everything. And that's just creating more problems. What we aren't good at, so we're good at adding, we're not good at subtracting. So how do we get into that mindset where we're actually taking things off the table? It's a huge part of what we seem to need to do.
Yeah.
One more question. How much time do you think we have left for all this?
I can tell you, we got 15 minutes.
That's the revolution, huh?
Begins in 15 minutes.
Okay.
I just want to comment on the idea of why there aren't any alternative movements for actually creating a genuine alternative. And I think it's because we have a dual situation where we want to create a movement that's going to actually, like a genuine movement for like socialism, or at least a genuinely left movement. But at the same time, we have this idea that if we exclude the people who are saying no, we shouldn't do that, and just people who just want to focus on protest or who say that they want something different, but it can't be socialism. We think that if we exclude those people, it's going to be a sectarian thing, which it tends to be when we try to create groups that are explicitly socialist or something. So we get stuck in a catch-22 where We can either create something that appears to be sectarian, or we can create something that we think is not adequate to address the conditions that we face.
Any other answers to questions? So yeah, go ahead. Did you have your hand up?
Sort of. Do we have to have a revolution? Can we evolve?
Can we evolve in what way?
Can we? Does it have
to like this system, maybe?
Does it have to be crisis mode?
Oh, I
It's
see.
crisis mode already, but does it have to be a revolution in the sense of upsetting everything?
Well, yeah, I could start there, I suppose. I mean, how much time is left? I could start there, maybe, because a lot of this is posed in very existential terms for very correct, absolute reasons. In terms of, we've already hit 400 parts per million. We're supposed to be aiming for 2 degrees. We're on the way to 4. The mainstream was saying, well, we won't hit 450 parts per million, which they didn't want to do, even though now scientists are saying 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. We won't hit 450 until 2100. Well, now we're going to hit 450 at current rates in the next 20 years. So even more severe dislocation, more rapidly than the scientists were previously saying. On the other hand, so that's a pretty existential crisis about the future of human civilization. On the other hand, there have been other crises similar to that, right? Not in terms of a planetary system, perhaps, but in terms of your entire ethnicity with the Holocaust. All of the, it makes me think about all of the organizing that went on in the death chambers, where Jewish slave laborers were consistently blowing up the gas chambers in order to slow down the process of the annihilation of Jews, fellow Jews. And so that kind of thing, that's an existential crisis. And yet organizing continued. Organizing continued amongst many, many times, obviously. And what W.E.B. Du Bois talks about, the Great Slave Strike, right? He talks about it in those terms, that actually it's the slaves themselves who were responsible for the end of slavery, not the white Lincoln or anything like that. And it's interesting that in our times, when we don't see agency amongst working people so much, many of the most popular cultural, as good as the film Lincoln was, for example, there's no space there for the slaves, right, to actually liberate themselves, which is what actually happened. And so there have been lots of other times, and people probably can have other examples, whereby there was a time limit on survival that humans then acted against in the most desperate of conditions. And I think we're more forewarned and forearmed now and more able to act than we've ever been in those prior situations, even though we know that there are some species, for sure, we're wiping out species 100 times faster than the geological statistical norm. So there are many species that we're not going to save. That's a reality, and it's disturbing and sad. But that doesn't, I think, in many ways, the question of how long do we have left or whatever is a bit of an irrelevance or a red herring, because it becomes a bit disempowering, because it's like, I don't care actually, I'm going to fight anyway. And all of my heroes all did too. So in that regard, I think a revolution is absolutely necessary. They've shown, right, just with Occupy, what was that about? It was just some people gathering together in public spaces peacefully to talk about politics and decide that maybe they thought funding in society should go from the government, should go towards other things than the banks. 2 months into that movement, and the government of the US decided that they'd had enough of that kind of democracy, and overnight, 17 cities, the occupations were all taken down forcibly, coordinated from the White House, as we know. So if they won't tolerate that level of discussion and debate, imagine what they're going to do when we say, actually, we want to nationalize and take over the industry of energy. And I would put it to you, for example, as a question. what is the best way of reducing, in the most rapid manner possible, cancer? Is it A, to continue to apply lots and lots of research dollars, funding, and so on and so forth to target oncogenes and cancerous cells and find out through science different ways in which we can treat cancers that come about? Or, answer B, is it for the workers and community to take over industry and run it along egalitarian social justice kind of lines? Which one of those methods is more likely in the least amount of time to reduce the incidence of cancer before it even occurs, right? Not treat it after the fact. So, in other words, is cancer a biological factor, or is it a social factor? Or where does one end and the other begin? And I think that that is a really important point, because actually I don't think you can disaggregate those questions. In the exact same way, I don't think that there's any question on the planet right now that cannot equally be well described as an ecological justice question as much as it can a social justice question. So if you are fighting to stop repossession of homes, that's cast as a social question. If you save somebody's home, which is their environment where they live, why is that not an ecological question, right? Or the fight for 15 in the United States, low-wage workers. What will it look like if that fight is won? And how will the environment of those workers change when they walk back into their workplace empowered in front of a cowed management? How will that extra money then transform other aspects of their environment in really meaningful ways? So is the fight for 15 a social justice struggle, or is it an environmental struggle? Again, I don't think you can separate those questions. And actually, I don't think we're going to win one without the other, and that's kind of what I write about in the book, right? There's no way we're going to get any positive ecological change without some positive social change, and vice versa, which is really where I think the environmental movement, the mainstream movement, has been rightly criticized for ignoring the ways in actually the environment. And most scientists, most lefties, avoid the term environment anyway these days. I'm glad you brought it up. And would use the word ecology or ecological. Why? Because the environment is a very loaded term, and it posits immediately the bourgeois dichotomy between one thing and the other, right? That if out there is the environment, then I'm something else from that. In other words, humans are separate from their environment, whereas if it's an ecological question, we're embedded within it. So actually the language is really important to think about, because also, well, why does our urban environment have to be such unappealing, concrete horrendousness? Why aren't we talking about, for example, in terms of solutions, the complete reintegration of urban and rural living in the way that Marx talked about overcoming the metabolic rift, right? So that how much space do cars take up? For example, 90% of the time, anybody who has a car, 90% of the time, a car is not in use. 90 to 95% on average. So, but it doesn't go away. Think about all that space, not when they're on the road, but when they're parked. So 1/3 of residential space in several American cities, US cities, is non-residential parking. 1/3 of the city space, non-residential, that doesn't even count all people's individual driveways. And so think about what you could replace in the city. If you took cars out of the equation, what would we build in their place? That's an amazing thing to think about. Which means we're getting back to the idea of public transport and rearranging urban planning and so on to accommodate that kind of change. But then when you start rethinking that and getting to the developing world, there are lots of stages of development that can be totally skipped over. In the way that the global south has largely avoided telegraph poles, right, because they've all got cell phones, what else about development could they actually skip over if they were given the capital and technology transfer, so that actually the world would be led by the South with the North trying to catch up because it's so expensive to rearrange cities that have already been built. So I think that that is a really inspiring vision too. And so I'm all for the idea that we should avoid the word environment for the reasons that I pointed out, but also because your environment is different because of racism. And so, and it is perceived differently by different people. And so we have to be cognizant of that in a way in which the mainstream environmental movement in the US at least has not been, and has been rightly criticized. You know, Van Jones said, well, look, the truth is we have two environmental movements. We're too polite to say we have a segregated movement. So we say we've got a mainstream environmental movement and we've got an environmental justice movement. And the two don't operate together. And so actually, racism is so embedded in US society that it's fractured the movement itself, starting in the 1980s. And so, activists in the US, such as myself and others, are trying to overcome 40 years of separation racially in the environmental movement to rethink a lot of the things that are going on. And now the mainstream movement is finally responding to some of the criticisms of the environmental justice movement. And that was an important point too, because the environmental justice movement, which has had much more success than any of the mainstream groups with all their multi-million-dollar budgets, put a very important word in it, right? They put the word justice in it, which immediately posits that there are two sides. In other words, there is a power relationship going on. In other words, you can't just go and talk to people and say, look, this is bad for everybody, why don't you do something about it? It's like, no, they're not going to do something because they don't care, because they're making too much money. And so I think that is something that we can learn from. And then, nobody would have predicted Occupy Wall Street before it happened. I think this is an important point about mass struggle. Sorry, thanks. I've got to finish.
Yeah, sorry.
Then I'll finish here. And so people are talking about the Anthropocene as the possible terminology to use. I think there is another term coming from Epicurus and Theophrastus called the Oikotocene, which means the age of conformity to nature. And I think if we unite some of that kind of thinking with the thinking around Buen Vivir, indigenous thought, which obviously knows quite a bit about how to be sustainable on the land, then we could think about actually living communally, collectively, cooperatively with real democracy, where we are in control of our own destinies in a very real sense, and actually get to know what it means to be fully human, because I don't think we've got any idea at the moment. And I don't think it's all about ideas, but maybe we could talk more about that question. And I also think that some of the most exciting struggles are not just in Latin America, but also in China, where massive struggles are building around environmental questions, and who knows where the next struggle is going to break out and how it's going to inspire the rest of us. Thanks very much.